I think royal duty is extremely important. I think it's part of the fabric of what the royal family and any future.
It started with white roses and royal flags, but something darker lurked beneath the gold ceilings. The day had been meticulously planned, with every detail tailored to showcase royal continuity. Dignitaries seated in perfect rows, courtiers whispering with rehearsed precision, and photographers capturing the grandeur through hushed lenses. Buckingham Palace gleamed under the June sun, a timeless symbol of stability. But under its surface, something was simmering. It wasn't loud or obvious, just a subtle shift in energy, an unspoken awareness that the air felt too still. Behind the polished smiles and ceremonial uniforms, aides exchanged uncertain glances. This wasn't nerves, this was intuition. Prince William's request had come quietly, but its implications were anything but. He had asked to speak, alone. No joint statement with his father, no warm introductions from Queen Camilla, just him. The announcement was downplayed, a short address, they said. Routine. Yet palace insiders knew better. In the royal world, spontaneity is rare, and unpredictability is feared. Every speech, every phrase is normally scrutinized, rehearsed, approved. But William's move bypassed the usual machinery. That alone sent tremors through the palace halls. The build-up to his entrance was tense. He walked with measured grace, but behind the confident gait, there was a weight that hadn't been there before. Not arrogance, purpose. Those who had served the late Princess Diana recognized it instantly. A quiet defiance. The kind that doesn't shout, but shakes the room nonetheless. They'd seen that look before when Diana broke protocol to speak her truth, even if it meant shaking the foundations of the monarchy. And now, her son carried that same fire beneath the calm. Cameras clicked. Reporters braced for the familiar. But within the sea of ceremonial pomp, something was breaking form. It was more than just William's request. It was in the way courtiers stopped mid-step. The way Charles looked, not at his son, but through him. The way Camilla shifted in her seat. This wasn't just a speech. This was a moment. One that didn't fit within the day's prescribed narrative of harmony. Because what the world was about to witness wasn't a celebration of continuity, it was the beginning of a reckoning. The crowd didn't know it yet, but tradition was about to be challenged in the most unorthodox way. Something was shifting, and not quietly. This ceremony, dressed in old-world elegance, was about to become a stage for a new kind of royal power play. A page was turning, not with a whisper, but with a silent quake that would echo beyond the palace walls. But as William stepped to the podium, the monarchy's script shattered. He didn't speak like a prince. He spoke like a monarch in waiting. As the echoes of formal introductions faded into silence, the tension that had gripped the room hardened into something palpable. William didn't need to raise his voice, his presence alone demanded attention. The cadence of his words was slow, steady, and almost hauntingly composed. Yet each syllable carried a gravity that pressed against centuries of tradition. There were no royal platitudes, no rehearsed nods to protocol. Instead, there was a call for reckoning delivered with the cool authority of someone who had waited long enough. He began with legacy, the kind the monarchy had always leaned on to justify its existence. He paid homage to the crown's storied past, acknowledging the lineage he was born into. But almost immediately, he veered off the expected path. Legacy, he said, meant nothing without relevance. He spoke of a nation that was evolving, of a people who deserved transparency, not symbolism. And just like that, the speech turned into something else. It wasn't just a reflection, it was a manifesto, a quiet upheaval wrapped in royal vocabulary. Then came the pivot that changed everything. William revealed a restructuring of the monarchy's internal leadership, a modern advisory council that would redefine the way royal duties were executed. No longer would tradition dictate hierarchy alone. Princess Anne, known for her relentless commitment to service, Prince Edward, the steadfast bridge between generations, and Catherine, his partner in both life and purpose, they would now hold expanded roles. This wasn't just symbolic, it was structural. William had redrawn the lines of influence, handing real power to those he trusted, and subtly removing it from those who had long basked in unearned prominence. Without ever uttering the word regency, he made it abundantly clear. He was no longer merely preparing to inherit the throne. He was stepping into it functionally, if not formally. With the king's quiet blessing, he would now lead the day-to-day responsibilities of the crown. From domestic ceremonies to international diplomacy, William was the new face of royal authority. It was a shift so profound that one historian later described it as a coronation without the crown, a changing of the guard without the trumpets. And yet, through all of this seismic movement, through all the applauded vision and unspoken power grabs, there was one glaring omission. One absence that cast a long, uncomfortable shadow over the grandeur of William's words. Because while names were honored and roles were expanded, one name, one presence was left untouched. But what wasn't said hit harder than what was. Camilla's name never came up. She didn't just slump in her chair, she was erased in real time. As William's voice carried through the grand hall, Camilla sat motionless, her composure eroding by the second. Each line of his speech widened the gulf between her and the vision being declared. It wasn't just what he said, it was what he deliberately didn't. Her name, her role, her years of public service, nothing. In a ceremony where every nod of acknowledgement held weight, the silence surrounding Camilla was deafening. She wasn't a footnote, she was invisible. And everyone noticed. The audience shifted uncomfortably. Aides avoided eye contact. The queen consort, once so visible, had become a shadow in the room. The tension around her was no longer just emotional, it became physical. Her grip tightened on the ceremony program clutched in her hands, her knuckles blanching under pressure. She shifted, once, then again. Her breathing deepened, but it couldn't mask the mounting distress in her eyes. A royal accustomed to enduring public judgment, Camilla had weathered decades of scrutiny. But this wasn't about gossip or tabloid speculation. This was institutional erasure. With every new initiative William unveiled, the message became clearer. She wasn't part of the monarchy's future. Not structurally, not symbolically, not at all. Then it happened. It wasn't a dramatic fall, no theatrical collapse, but it didn't need to be. Her body folded forward slightly, then completely. The room froze. Gasps erupted. Charles's voice, usually so tempered, cracked as he uttered one word, her name, Camilla. Within moments, aides rushed to her side, hands reaching for support, urgency suddenly overriding the ceremony's rigid formality. Medical personnel emerged. The audience stood in stunned silence as the queen consort, pale and shaken, was carefully lifted from her seat and quietly escorted out of the hall. In a monarchy built on spectacle and control, this moment was neither. The cameras didn't stop rolling. Footage leaked within minutes, sparking an avalanche of public reaction. But for those within the palace walls, the meaning was much heavier than headlines. It was the collapse of more than a person. It was the collapse of certainty, of assumptions, of old hierarchies that had once seemed untouchable. Palace insiders would later whisper that Camilla's faint wasn't just stress, it was devastation, not from illness, but from the piercing realization that she had been written out of the narrative in front of her peers, her family, and the world. Speculation exploded. Was this omission part of a long-planned transition? Had William acted unilaterally, or had Charles known and stayed silent? Why had Camilla, once a central figure, been so conspicuously excluded? The questions had no official answers, just layers of implication. But one thing was undeniable. The collapse was no coincidence. It was the breaking point of a woman who had fought tooth and nail to stand beside a king, only to be removed without a word. The queen consort was carried out, but the kingdom's crisis had just begun. Phones rang. Doors slammed. No one could agree on what to say next. The ceremony had barely ended when chaos gripped the palace like a vice. What was meant to be a celebration of continuity had dissolved into crisis within minutes. In the press office, aides scrambled to craft a narrative that made sense. But how do you spin a queen collapsing mid-ceremony? How do you explain a speech that sidelines a reigning consort without warning? No prepared statement could undo what had just played out in front of cameras, and before a global audience already piecing together the implications faster than the institution could react. Inside Buckingham, the tension was not just palpable, it was volcanic. Staff split down in visible lines. Some believed this was a calculated move by William, a long-orchestrated plan executed with cold precision. Others insisted it couldn't have been sanctioned by the king, arguing Charles would never have allowed such a public dismantling of his wife's standing. Rumors swirled that Charles had received a draft of William's speech days before but dismissed it, believing his son wouldn't go through with it. Now, with the world watching and Camilla's image crumbling in real time, that complacency looked like a catastrophic misstep. The king was nowhere near composed. Witnesses described him as visibly shaken, pale, and withdrawn after Camilla's collapse. He reportedly retreated to his private quarters, emerging only briefly, before ordering a closed-door emergency meeting with senior advisors. For a man raised in the art of control, the disarray was as foreign as it was humiliating. The crown that once gave him authority now seemed to isolate him. Even his most trusted courtiers appeared uncertain about how to proceed. The monarchy wasn't speaking with one voice anymore, it was speaking in whispers, and none of them were in sync. And the divide was growing louder by the hour. Within palace walls, loyalties were being tested like never before. One faction rallied behind Charles, urging a swift response, perhaps even a public reaffirmation of Camilla's role. Another, more forward-looking group, stood with William, arguing that the prince's actions reflected the future the public actually wanted. To many younger aides, the shift wasn't betrayal. It was inevitability. The monarchy could either evolve with William or risk irrelevance, clinging to a figure who, fairly or not, still carried decades of public baggage. Outside those walls, the public was demanding answers. Social media had erupted, headlines were relentless, and speculation dominated every news cycle. Was this a royal coup, a silent dethroning, or the unveiling of a long-brewing transformation? The palace, caught flat-footed, couldn't find a single message to settle the noise. Every silence became a statement. Every delay fed the fire. But amidst the wreckage of tradition and confusion, one thing became clear: this wasn't about ceremony anymore. It was personal. It was about legacy. It was about a family's pain dressed up in royal robes. And to understand this chaos, we must trace it to its emotional root, Princess Diana. He wasn't just making a move, he was answering a decades-old call. For those who saw Prince William's speech as abrupt or cold, they missed the quiet storm that had been building inside him for years. His decision to upend tradition, to sideline Camilla, and to step into a leadership role before the crown was officially his, wasn't impulsive. It was rooted in grief, memory, and a promise he never made aloud, but always lived by. Because this wasn't about power, it was about legacy, and at the center of that legacy was his mother, Princess Diana. Diana didn't just change the public's perception of the monarchy, she rewrote the emotional script for what it meant to be royal. Where others wore duty like armor, she led with vulnerability. She shook hands with AIDS patients when fear kept others away. She cried openly, smiled easily, and bled in public without shame. William grew up watching a woman who chose truth over protocol, connection over perfection. And when that voice was silenced too soon, it didn't disappear, it echoed. In his heart, in his principles, in the kind of monarch he would one day choose to become. William's rebellion wasn't loud, it was meticulous. It didn't come in the form of protests or statements of defiance. It came in the form of structural change. He built a vision where transparency wasn't an aspiration, it was the foundation. Where empathy wasn't a bonus, it was a requirement. Where public service wasn't symbolic, it was actionable. His leadership model wasn't inherited from the men who came before him. It was molded by a woman whose legacy had been bruised, buried, and rewritten to fit a narrative she never authored. William remembered, and in remembering, he began to reshape everything. The deeper truth, however, was more complex. William's restructuring of the monarchy also carried a weight he rarely acknowledged. A quiet mistrust that had simmered for decades centered not on the crown, but on the woman who now wore it beside his father. Camilla's rise had always been a wound he never fully allowed to heal. The pain of his mother's erasure in public life. The casual rewriting of history to accommodate a more palatable image of the present. In William's eyes, Camilla may have found a place in the royal script, but not in the future he envisioned. So when he delivered that speech, when he left Camilla's name out entirely, it wasn't just omission, it was declaration, a correction, a line drawn in royal ink, signaling that the new monarchy would not be built on unfinished business or blurred lines. It would be a house reconstructed from the rubble Diana left behind. He didn't need to say her name. Every word he spoke did. But correcting the past meant undoing Camilla's entire journey. She fought for decades to get here, and in one afternoon, it disappeared. Camilla's rise was never effortless. It was carved out of scandal, resistance, and public resentment. For years, she was branded the villain in one of the most painful chapters of modern royal history. The woman who stood in the shadow of Diana, the woman many believed had no rightful place near the throne. Yet she stayed. She endured the whispers, the headlines, the icy receptions, and through it all, she waited, quietly, strategically, until the world changed just enough for her to step forward. Becoming queen consort wasn't just a title for Camilla, it was vindication, a symbol that the monarchy, in all its rigidity, had finally embraced her. It wasn't an easy sell to the public, but she didn't try to win them with charm. She won them with resilience. By showing up, by standing next to Charles through political storms, family fractures, and national mourning. She didn't demand reverence, she earned a form of reluctant respect. Over time, the press softened, the public eased. And when the coronation came, it seemed the battle was finally over. She had arrived. But royal favor is fragile. And Camilla learned that the hard way when William stood at the heart of the palace and laid out his vision for the monarchy's future, with no mention of her. Not a word, not a roll, not even a thank you. After years of clawing her way into acceptance, she was erased with silence. And that silence cut deeper than any public insult ever could. Because this wasn't just about omission, it was about rejection. And not by the public this time, but from within the very family she'd spent decades defending. Sources close to the palace would later reveal that Camilla was blindsided, that she expected to be acknowledged, even symbolically. Instead, she watched as her name was scrubbed from the conversation, as if she had never mattered. As if all the years of damage control and diplomacy had been in vain. One former aide summed it up with chilling accuracy: she climbed the mountain, only for the rug to be pulled from under her at the top. The collapse at the ceremony wasn't just a moment of stress, it was the emotional reckoning of a woman who'd been quietly fighting to exist, only to be erased before a crowd of dignitaries and the eyes of the world. And it wasn't just personal, it was institutional. The palace made no effort to walk it back. No statements, no gestures of reassurance. Camilla's schedule was cleared. Her appearances vanished. The silence from the palace wasn't just cold, it was calculated. A slow, methodical fading of a woman who had once been promised a seat at the table, now watching the chairs rearranged without her. And as Camilla vanished from view, one woman stepped forward. In the middle of the wreckage, one figure stood calm and clear: Catherine. While Buckingham Palace reeled from internal fractures and public backlash, while Charles mourned the chaos and Camilla vanished into silence, she emerged not with declarations or strategy, but with quiet composure. Just days after the most destabilizing royal moment in decades, Catherine stepped into a modest charity event, unshaken, her presence deliberate, her purpose unmistakable. There were no headlines to seize, no flashbulbs to court, just a moment of steadiness in a storm the monarchy hadn't yet begun to contain. And in that moment, she delivered a single, 7-word statement that would ripple far beyond the walls of that hall. The future is about unity, service, together. No royal aide had written it. No press team had spun it. It was hers. And with it, she did what 1,000 crisis meetings could not. She grounded the monarchy. She made it human again. While the rest of the firm scrambled to cover fissures and deflect speculation, Catherine reminded the nation of what they truly expected from their royals. Not spectacle, not hierarchy stability. Her appearance, though understated, was everything William's speech had foreshadowed. If he was stepping into leadership, she was anchoring the crown's emotional weight, not just beside him but as his equal in presence, in purpose, and in power. Public response was instant and overwhelming. Social media platforms erupted not with division, but with clarity. Memes, tweets, and videos crowned her not just a duchess, not just a princess, but the queen the people already saw. She wasn't loud, she wasn't defiant, but her stillness echoed. Across generations, even critics began acknowledging her role not as a supporting figure, but as the center. One viral post read, "Diana walked so Catherine could rise. The monarchy's heart now beats through her." The press took the cue. Headlines shifted. Coverage pivoted. Kate rose as Camilla fell. One outlet declared, "The juxtaposition brutal, but undeniable." Analysts marveled at her timing. Commentators praised her poise. But for those watching closely, this wasn't strategy. It was Catherine being who she had always been. Steady, consistent, quietly powerful. The contrast couldn't be starker. As Camilla disappeared without a trace, Catherine absorbed the vacuum not aggressively, but with a grace that made resistance impossible. She didn't ask for the spotlight. It found her. Because in a family divided, the public had already made their choice. And it was Catherine they trusted. But while the women defined the emotions, the real battle was behind palace walls. 2 monarchs in one palace, only one voice is being heard. Behind the gilded doors of Buckingham, a quiet but undeniable war had erupted. On the surface, the monarchy appeared intact, business as usual. But beneath the veneer, the institution was fracturing along ideological lines. On one side stood King Charles, a man steeped in tradition, groomed for decades to lead through continuity. On the other, Prince William, rising with a mandate of change, armed not with a crown but with momentum, and a vision the public had already begun to embrace. The palace no longer functioned as a unified body. Aides whispered in corners, alliances were redrawn, and departments previously guided by the king's office now looked to William for direction. Some clung to the old ways, urging Charles to reassert control and restore Camilla's presence. But others, younger, more attuned to the shifting cultural tides, placed their faith in William's streamlined model of service over ceremony. The divide was no longer speculative, it was operational. Meeting invites went out from different corridors. Decisions were made without consensus. Loyalty became currency, and silence was more valuable than protocol. King Charles, already battling ongoing health issues, found his authority fading with each passing day. Though he still wore the crown, his role had become largely ceremonial. He was briefed but rarely led, consulted but rarely overruled. Public engagements were reduced, state functions increasingly delegated, and with Camilla now completely absent from official duties, the image of a king in full control had collapsed into something more symbolic, less ruler, more relic. For Charles, the personal sting cut deeper than the political one. The woman he had fought to place by his side had been removed, not by illness, but by institutional inertia and the quiet assertion of his own son. Meanwhile, William wasn't waiting for formal approval. He had assumed the operational reins. International briefings, charity initiatives, even behind-the-scenes diplomacy, he was involved in everything that mattered. His team moved swiftly, often independently. Royal insiders began referring to William not as the heir apparent, but as the acting monarch. Catherine, always beside him, now took on increasing influence as the public face of modern royalty. Together, they crafted a leadership style that was less about hierarchy and more about impact. And the world, sensing the shift, began responding to them accordingly. Camilla's absence only added fuel to the transformation. Her schedule, once full, had been cleared without explanation. No public statements, no informal sightings, no sign she would return to active royal life anytime soon. And within the palace, no one dared ask why. Because the answer was already clear. William's rise had triggered a silent exit, and Charles, despite his title, no longer had the power to stop it. A monarchy that once operated through a singular chain of command was now being pulled in two opposing directions. And soon, even the world would begin asking the unthinkable. Charles still wears the crown, but William already rules. That's the sentiment, quietly echoing through the palace corridors, whispered in press rooms, murmured in diplomatic circles, and shared across social media with increasing confidence. The official narrative may remain intact, but for all practical purposes, the monarchy has undergone a silent transformation. It wasn't signed into law, declared with ceremony, or etched into parchment, but it happened, and the world knows it. The man once seen as the future is now acting like the present, and the figure who fought to keep the crown's legacy alive is fading behind palace walls. The signs are no longer subtle. Public perception has shifted dramatically. Approval ratings speak volumes. William and Catherine are now regarded as the heart of the royal family, the couple who represents modernity, grace, and strength. In contrast, Charles appears increasingly sidelined. His rare appearances, guarded expressions, and detachment from key public events only deepen the speculation. And Camilla's continued absence, still unexplained, only adds fuel to the storm. Without her by his side, Charles looks incomplete, and the institution he was meant to lead appears leaderless. What was once whispered has now reached the global stage. Foreign dignitaries, ambassadors, and world leaders now request meetings with William first. He's the one representing Britain's face abroad. He's the one taking charge of international briefings, forging diplomatic relationships, and leading high-level royal initiatives. No coronation has crowned him, but in practice, he moves with the authority of a sovereign. His signature may not yet seal royal decrees, but his word shapes the monarchy's public course. He doesn't need to ask permission, he sets direction. Behind palace walls, this shift isn't contested, it's managed. A senior aide was quoted off-record saying, "The king signs the papers, but the world listens to William." That quiet truth, once considered disloyal, now frames the new reality. The baton has not been ceremoniously passed, but it has been grasped firmly, unapologetically, and without resistance. The royal household operates under a dual monarchy in everything but name, one by tradition, the other by influence, and it's the latter that's pulling the crown forward. So now, as Britain looks to the future, the question isn't whether William will be king, but whether, in the ways that matter most, he already is. A monarchy built on symbols is now being shaped by actions. And in this new era, where tradition bends to relevance, where silence speaks louder than decrees, and where public faith defines power, William has already arrived. Has William taken the throne without a crown? Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.